Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat World's Crusade. It is the year 765 of the 41st millennium, and the first year of the Warmaster Macaroth's reign. After the victory at Balhat, secured by his predecessor Slado, the new Warmaster has embarked upon an extraordinarily ambitious and large-scale offensive, striking towards the Cabal system, deep within the Sabbat worlds. We've already talked about how most of Slado's old generals, now Macaroth's new generals, thought the very idea insanity made manifest. The actions of an overreaching, incompetent, and inexperienced commander. We've also talked about how Macaroth was going to have to spend a lot of times soothing ruffled feathers, and bringing the old guard back in line with favors, promises, and rewards. But what about the realities of the situation? The plan itself? How was it actually going to work out? Well, Macaroth was no doubt a bit hesitant to entrust the old guard with the more serious tasks ahead, for fear that they might not put in their best performance. And so a vast new crop of commanders, generals, and marshals were also raised up alongside Macaroth, the young guard. These would be Macaroth's men, people he trusted, people he liked, and people in whom he could see the same spark of greatness that he believed dwelled within himself. Incidentally, this is also part of the reason for the mass wave of promotions, as they were primarily two. One, entirely reasonable and logical, Macaroth at his best, the planner, the visionary. And the other reason, Macaroth at his worst, the impulsive gambler and the preening peacock. Because if there was one flaw you could truly lay at Macaroth's feet, it was pride, and a general distaste for all those who did not meet his own exacting standards. So, the first reason, obviously, was the simple fact that Macaroth could not be absolutely certain that the old guard of generals would obey his orders with the same vim and vigor as they had his predecessors. Thus, he required a brood of fresh blood, young generals who owed their stripes and their future successors to Macaroth, becoming in turn then a solid foundation for him to stand upon, and creating a crop of generals whose successors would in essence be his successors, rather than those of Slado's hand-picked men. The other reason was because Macaroth himself genuinely believed himself to be every bit the leader that Slado had been, and better. And one of Slado's greatest virtues was his eye for personnel, which Macaroth now moved to equal and supersede. And in so doing, he appointed a fair few individuals based first and foremost on his gut feeling about them, rather than any demonstrable history of excellence. Macaroth's gambler's instinct would create a fair few generals and commanders, and whilst on several occasions his gut was proven correct, on others, well, when one gambles, one inevitably sooner or later loses. But the opening moves in Macaroth's new offensive would seem to justify his every action. As the first world to be invaded in the new general offensive, Nonimas would become the model of the Macarothian method. Nonimas was a vital logistical world for the future of the Crusade. As it pushed ever deeper into the Sabbat worlds and its supply lines lengthened, it was desperately in need of a major agricultural world to feed its countless armies. And Nonimas would be just that. With several large hives surrounded by seemingly endless fields and farms, along with vertical hydroponics facilities within the hive's depths, it was the perfect planet to feed the Crusade. But all of this would, of course, be worthless if the enemy managed to destroy it, or worse still, if it was ruined in the world's taking. Nonimas was that most difficult of military objectives, one that must be taken swiftly, with little preparation, and cleanly in the face of enemy resistance. Yet, due to Macaroth's hand-picked regiments, with the Praeger regiment at its head, the world was seized in a mere 6 weeks, with virtually all of its agricultural industry and its logistics for bringing its produce into orbit captured intact. This was the Macarothian method, utilizing his incredible levels of, well, literally weaponized autism. Macaroth could keep the details and qualities of every commander, every regiment, and every world in his mind all at once, and select the appropriate force for the appropriate objective, and deliver them there on a schedule with a level of precision perhaps not seen since the days of the Primarchs, or the Lord Solar himself. And Macaroth did not content himself merely with launching new offensives, he also went back and looked at the various conflicts still ongoing behind the lines, and redid Slado's work. An impertinent thing to do if it weren't for the fact that he did so successfully. For example, on the world of Grimoire. On this planet, Slado's chosen man had been bogged down for the last 6 months, facing off against Chaos Magister Sharanidi, who had managed to counter every move made by Slado's man. And whilst the Magister was fighting an unavoidably losing war, with no hope of relief or victory, he was tying down valuable Imperial Guard resources and Navy elements at a time in which Macaroth was ordering all forces to launch a general advance. But Macaroth had the remedy for the situation. Now again, it's a rare, fresh commander indeed that would reach back and redo his predecessor's work, particularly the work of a predecessor as loved and respected as Slado was, even more so now as after his passing, his memory was at its absolute highest. Yet, Macaroth still took the risk of sacking the commander in charge of the Imperial forces and replacing him with General Notches Sturm. A man of some reputation, a fair bit of it earned as well, but a great deal of it was probably built on the back not of his tactical or strategic acumen, but rather his favoured regiment, which he made sure came with him wherever he went, the Royal Voltimand 50th. A luxuriously equipped regiment from a wealthy world that produces some of the finest heavy assault infantry in the Imperium. And when they arrived along with their general, they didn't merely manage to unstick the situation that had been so thoroughly bogged down for 6 months, they secured victory in a week. 7 days was all it took for Notches Sturm and the Royal Voltimand 50th to crush a foe the Imperial Guard had struggled to deal with for half a year. It was nothing short of a miracle, really. and more than made up for any potential impertinence in Macaroth's decision to meddle in his predecessor's decisions. But of course, it wasn't all stunning successes either. By and large, Macaroth's maneuvers worked out very well indeed, but there were exceptions. And Oscila 9 was one of those exceptions. We've already mentioned how Macaroth had raised up a whole new cadre of commanders, many of whom proved themselves to be more than able and capable. A precious few even made it clear that they should have been elevated a long, long time ago, as they possessed a genuine talent for command. But some, well, they were what the old guard commanders feared Macaroth would be, men elevated beyond their stations. You see, this is a common thing in virtually all hierarchies, and frankly, epidemic within the Imperium. By and large, a man tends to be elevated to the point where he will excel, say, for example, as a commander of a regiment. A hypothetical officer could be perfectly capable, indeed to the point of excelling, at dealing with all of the elements required to run a regimental-sized formation. He can get comfortable with all of the officers, learn the traits, the weaknesses, and the strengths of the men under his command, and the specializations of the various companies, platoons, and squads. He might be able to run it like a well-oiled machine. In other words, he will excel as a regimental officer. But, of course, when you're doing a great job at one level within an organization, near inevitably somebody is going to come along and go, "Hey, you're doing a fantastic job here. I'm going to give you a promotion." Now suddenly our regimental officer is in charge of a brigade. He's no longer commanding 2,000 men, he's commanding 4,000 men. And he no longer manages to keep as good a grasp of all of his officers. He no longer manages to recall the specific strengths and weaknesses of his various platoons, much less so the squads underneath them again. He still manages the day-to-day running of the brigade, and he does an adequate job, but he certainly does not excel any longer. And that is usually where it ends. This is the virtually inevitable result of any hierarchical system like this. A person will excel in a position, thus he will be elevated from that position because he's doing such a good job into the next position, where he does not achieve the same level of mastery. Thus, as he now becomes just one amongst all the other brigade commanders, he is not elevated any further, meaning that the majority of commanders will be placed at just slightly above the level that they truly understand and master. But sometimes, either through connections, through casualties, through politicking, or simple ambition, that brigade commander will be placed in charge of a division, and will find himself completely over his head. That is what happened with many of Macaroth's new generals. They were entirely capable of commanding the formations they had previously been in charge in, but now that they were assigned command over entire theaters or planet-wide areas of operation, they were simply incapable of wrapping their heads around all of the extra duties that they were now expected to carry out. Perhaps they did not master the logistical side of organizing a planet-wide campaign. Perhaps they did not understand the politicking between the Imperial Navy and the Imperial Guard, and thus didn't manage to create a smooth cooperation between the two forces, obviously impeding them. Or perhaps they didn't manage to keep their higher officers, now also with fair bits of egos of their own, in line. Whatever it was, something broke. Some level of that command was too complex for them, too demanding. And so Oscila 9, despite being considered to be a slam dunk, a surefire victory, something nobody could mess up, an opportunity for new commanders to cut their teeth on an enemy just the right side of helpless, turned into a disaster. Collateral damage was through the roof, the planet was virtually ruined and worthless to the Imperium, and were still casualties amongst the Guard forces mounted day by day, with no victory in sight, until overwhelming, crushing force could be redirected to the world. And in a phase of the Crusade like this, where Macaroth had just launched the second phase of operations on a very tight schedule, these kinds of disasters were simply not acceptable. Macaroth did not have the men, did not have the time, and certainly did not have the popular support for these kinds of debacles. Nor, unfortunately, however, was Macaroth in such a comfortable position that he could afford the blows to his prestige by admitting his error and firing these generals either. He had to allow them to blunder their way to victory before quietly reassigning them somewhere else, far away from active combat operations. Meanwhile, a man who had not been elevated beyond his position, despite certain cause for it to happen, and had instead been, if anything, relegated to a far lesser command than he was intended to, Colonel-Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt was undergoing his first baptism of fire as a regimental commander, in essence. As, of course, as we covered in the previous video, the 3 regiments he was supposed to be commanding, a reinforced brigade in essence, well, he'd only been able to actually rescue 1 of them, or the general equivalent of 1 reinforced regiment, which now referred to itself as the Tanith First and Only. Gaunt was still struggling to get his newfound regiment under full control, and his first action alongside them was very nearly his final action alongside them as well, as the Tanith were deployed to a world by the name of Blackshard, where they would be deployed in their preferred role as reconnaissance and infiltration specialists, assisting the 10th Royal Sloker Regiment. They were to infiltrate an enemy city, a massively fortified city the Slokans had had significant problems breaking into, and they wanted the Tanith to try and find an easier way in. Acquiescing to this request, the Tanith entered through the sewer systems and into the underlevels of the city. Infiltrating into its depths, they neutralized several smaller groups of enemies and located what appeared to be a relatively viable entrance point for future operations against the city. But before withdrawing, they came across what appeared to be some sort of heretical temple. Obviously enough, they resolved to destroy it, and the Colonel-Commissar stayed behind to rig the final charges with his chief demolitions expert, Major Elim Rawn. Now, Eli was not actually a particularly big fan of the Colonel-Commissar. In fact, he downright hated him and blamed him quite personally for the destruction of Tanith, and so he hit him over the head and attempted to leave him right next to the explosives to die. Fair enough, I do suppose. Well, Gaunt turned out to have a harder head than his recently appointed major had reckoned with, and got back up again, beat Elim senseless, and then dragged his recumbent form out of the blast radius and to safety, rejoining the rest of the Tanith regiment after setting the timer which would destroy the Chaos Temple. Apparently a remarkably important Chaos Temple as well, as all of the defenders inside of the temple thereafter committed mass suicide. Lucky. Allowing the 10th Royal Sloka Regiment to simply march on into the city, and allowed Gaunt to strike at least a truce with Ron. Seeing as he had now saved his life, Ron decided to not, fail at killing Gaunt again, so the next time he'd do it, he'd be sure of doing it correctly. Well, it's a ceasefire of sorts, I do suppose. Not all of the Tanith regiment's collaborations with other regiments was quite so painless, however, as their second deployment was to the planet of Voltimand, where they yet again were given orders to act as advanced scouts and infiltrators. They were to take on another major fortified town, this time alongside Colonel Oritz's 17th Quetzalcoatl Armored Regiment, a self-propelled artillery battery formation, and the 50th Royal Volpon Blue Bloods under Guillaume d'Anvers de Banzi Height Gilbert, or just Gilbert, I suppose. And the 50th was, of course, again under the command of General Notches Sturm, fresh from his remarkable success at Grimoire, and eager to add another conquest to his reputation. No doubt he felt as if the eyes of Macaroth were upon him, and that there might just be a big juicy promotion in his future if he played his cards right now. So, the operation was simple enough. The Tanith were to attempt to infiltrate the city, as they were self-declared infiltration specialists, and their achievements on Blackshard seemed to back up their reputation. This time, however, they were not quite so lucky. The Tanith sought to gain entry into Voltis City via the Western Sanitation outfalls, essentially infiltrating through the sewage system, assuming they would either be poorly guarded or blocked off in some way that the Tanith could bypass. They were not poorly guarded, however, and the Tanith were swiftly discovered. And following a brief firefight, the Chaos Defenders flooded the sanitation outlets and flushed the guardsmen out along with the city's shit and piss. A less than glorious end to the operation, which appeared to then be a complete failure. However, as a distraction for this infiltration attempt, a significant portion of the Tanith First and Only had been placed under the command of Sergeant Klugen. They were to attack the walls directly and attempt to draw the defenders' interests away from the infiltrators. However, Klugen and his lads went far above and beyond their duties, managing to somehow breach the enemy's defenders, enter into the city, and then detonate a major ammunition dump right behind the curtain walls. Presumably a storage of rounds for the wall guns, one would assume. This opened up a 100-meter wide rent in the city's walls. A perfect opportunity for the Royal Volpon 50th to sweep on in and seize the city. So, even in failure, the Tanith had somehow managed to pull off their objective. This, however, did not sit as well with General Notches Sturm and Gilbert as you might think, as the way things were standing now, the Tanith had a little bit too much credit to gain in the seizure of Voltis City, and Notches Sturm, of course, looking for that big fat promotion, wanted more of it for himself and less for the Tanith. Thus, he gave instructions to Colonel Oritz of the 17th Quetzalcoatl Armored Regiment to begin a bombardment against a fleeing mass of Chaos forces, which just so happened to be in the exact same location as the route the ghosts were supposed to be withdrawing along. Now, earlier that day, the Quetzalcoatl Regiment had been aided by the Tanith in seeing off a chaos ambush upon their formation, which happened across their basilisks and bombards just as they were traversing towards the front line. A very potentially hairy situation for the artillery regiment, which could have led to serious casualties were it not for the intervention of the Tanith. Thus, Colonel Oritz was obviously reluctant to obey his general's commands, but they were made into a direct order, and he had no choice but to comply with it. During the ensuing bombardment, the Tanith took a serious beating, as they, of course, did not expect to be hit by artillery from their own lines, and amongst the casualties was the hero of the operation, Sergeant Klugen, who was killed by an artillery strike whilst attempting to make his way back to Imperial lines. Incensed by this, the Colonel-Commissar, upon reaching Imperial lines, assaulted Colonel Oritz, punching him, before restraining himself, probably realizing that whatever instruction the colonel had received must have come from somewhere higher up. He went then directly to General Notchus Sturm's headquarters and seemed set to do the same to Sturm, who quite calmly said that he had received reports that the Colonel-Commissar had assaulted a fellow officer, a court-martial offense, of course. This appeared to have been his plan all along, but Colonel Oritz too arrived shortly thereafter and insisted that he had been injured due to a runaway recoil from his basilisk, not any aggravated assault perpetrated by the Colonel-Commissar. Good guy, that Oritz. Good guy. And this, incidentally, will not be the last time that Gaunt's temper will very nearly land him in deep, deep doo-doo indeed. In fact, as we will see later, it was only through luck and admittedly a fair bit of command talent that he survived some of his slip-ups. See, Gaunt is not a very good commissar, if I'm to be entirely honest with you. He is a fine colonel and an excellent motivator of men, but as a political officer, oh boy, he's not very political, shall we say. And the luck of the Tanith would not improve anytime soon either, as their third action was on the world of Caligula, a massive agricultural province, which was slated to be taken swiftly via massed orbital assault, with the Tanith being deployed on the front line of this action. Apparently, their credentials as expert infiltrators had taken a rather large dent after their failure on Voltimand. You could argue that their failure was not quite so egregious, but apparently Imperial High Command disagreed. The assault on Caligula, by the way, was very nearly an absolute unmitigated disaster, as the Chaos Forces had anticipated the Imperium's actions, probably having seen Macaroth's habit of launching all-or-nothing, do-or-die swift assaults on countless other worlds. Thus, they had summoned a demonic entity to create a vast storm above its main hive cities, currently under attack by transport ships. Yeah, you can see how this would complicate things, and a huge portion of the Imperial force was either destroyed or blown massively off course, including Gaunt's own shuttle, which landed dozens of kilometers from the actual drop zone. leaving Colonel Colm Corbeck to actually lead the Tanith elements during the attack on the Hive. And luckily for the Colonel-Commissar, the man he chose to lead the Tanith regiment by, well, simple sheer virtue of him having showed up in his office, proved to be a fine commander. Lucky that, as he managed to actually destroy the creature creating the storm by calling down an orbital bombardment on his own position. Right next to the demon. Well, what is there to say but applause, I guess. The man clearly had some serious cojones on him. The Tanith would remain on the planet for quite some time, running supplies and reinforcements around the planet as well, as Caligula, see, it had not been as thoroughly conquered as many other worlds. It had been torn open from the inside via, yet again, an interesting piece of infiltration. See, we are going to touch upon this once more later, but the Chaos Forces, particularly the Nurgle ones in the Sabbat worlds, demonstrated remarkable ingenuity on multiple occasions. Here, they had apparently managed to introduce a specific kind of seed into the planet. Now, whether this was through design or greed is unclear even to the Inquisition today. Caligula was, as mentioned, a major agricultural world, and it is entirely possible that a greedy noble looking to increase his output of agricultural produce above all of his competitors decided to delve into some dubious science for increased growth and productivity, regardless of where it came from. And it is also entirely likely that this was a contagion introduced by someone with a less than wholesome agenda. Regardless, a new strain of crops, which had been spliced in with the native crops of the world, were of unnatural origins. And as they spread across the planet, as they did indeed produce bumper harvests, they exposed a huge portion of the population to the taint of chaos. Again, surprisingly subtle for Grandfather Nurgle. After these 3 deployments, which had all proven rather nasty, I'm sure the Colonel-Commissar was hoping for a return to infiltration operations, a little bit of a easing up of the pressure, particularly after Caligula, which was by all accounts a massive shit show. And the Tanith had certainly had more than enough of those after the destruction of their entire world, which now, incidentally, recent Imperial intelligence suggested had been carried out specifically by a war fleet under the command of Magister Ruschek Vakim, a name that had become quite the boogeyman amongst the Imperial forces, as a Manchester who seemed to always know just where to strike and just what to avoid to cause the Imperium maximum headache. But the Colonel-Commissar's hopes for a slightly easier posting were to be betrayed. Instead, he was dispatched to Fortis Binary, where his light infantry scouts with, well, no field piece heavier than a mortar were placed in a trench war against Nurgle cultists. You know, seeing as we just spent the preceding, 15-odd minutes praising Macaroth's ability to correctly judge the capabilities of regiments and place them where they were most likely to do the most good, this seems like a rather obvious mistake, but well, there are possible explanations for it. First and foremost, of course, was the simple fact that the Tanith were a freshly formed regiment. from a world with no martial history, and so perhaps Macaroth, in his infinite wisdom, or whomever it was that issued their marching orders, simply didn't know that they were a light infantry regiment. That's possible. Or, alternatively, Macaroth, who had on several occasions proven himself to be a somewhat petty character, might have looked at the name of the commander, Colonel-Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt, and recognized him as one of the hand-picked individuals that Sladeau had chosen for his command cadre at the onset of the Crusade, and decided to, put the man to the test, or have him killed. One out of two. Either he would rise above and master his adversities, in which case, happy day, a good Imperial Guard commander, or he would catch a stray 105mm round and Macaroth would be rid one more of his predecessor's favored sons. A win-win scenario. Anywho, high command conspiracies aside, Fortis Binary had been a major forge and production world, possessing several major hive cities with significant industrial capabilities and a very, very large population of very downtrodden workers, some 19 billion all told. There was precious little information about how exactly the world had fallen in the first place, beyond the very apparent fact that the workers had apparently had enough of their overlords and decided to rise up en masse, easily overwhelming the local planetary defenders, those that didn't join the workers, that is, and the Chaos cultists under the sway of Nurgle called themselves the Shriven. It might have been tempting to simply leave the planet be due to its enormous infected population and the inherent difficulties of waging a major trench war against such a heavily defended foe, particularly as the enemy had been able to seize the vast majority of the world's manufacturing capabilities intact, meaning that they had had quite some time to prepare armor, artillery, weapons, and ammunition with which to resist an Imperial attempt to recapture the world. Worse still, of course, was the fact that, well, it was a major industrial hub, and thus, as usual, the Imperial commanders were given orders to seize the world, but to do it gently. You know, this is starting to sound an awful lot like a straight-up punishment detail, doesn't it? A fortified factory world that must be seized intact, occupied by 19 billion Chaos cultists, with access to a virtually unending store of artillery, weapons, and ammunition that has been given plenty of time to dig themselves in. Who, oh who amongst the Imperial command staff could have a low enough standing with the new boss to be assigned this hellhole, I wonder? Well, there were some things that Macaroth had inherited from Sladeau, and one of them was a distaste of Lord High Militant General Hector Drevere, who was given the assignment of retaking Fortis Binary. And boy, was he not at all happy about it. See, Hector Drevere was a blunt instrument. In an ideal situation, given near infinite resources, he could be a very effective Imperial Guard commander, one of the most effective quite possibly, as he had no compunctions whatsoever against sacrificing any number of men so long as it brought him victory. And frankly, as far as the Imperium is concerned, manpower is pretty much its single cheapest resource, so Hector Dravir was, in essence, the perfect Imperial Guard commander. But there are, of course, scenarios in which simply choking the enemy with one's own side's corpses is less than effective. And the leading scenario in which this tactic is not all that it's made out to be is when you're fighting an enemy whose primary weapons are gas, disease, and secondary infections. For 6 months, Dravir's forces were bleeding out, choking on the vile mud of Fortis Binary. The literally poisonous mud of Fortis Binary, and the rate at which the troops were succumbing to chaos infestations and infections were nothing short of repugnant. The Inquisition, too, took an interest in Fortis Binary due to the overt nature of its corruption, and what at first appeared to be the mystery of its fall. Now, after the world was captured, investigations were carried out, secretive, of course, obviously, so as to not disturb anyone in a position to be disturbed by it, but in all due likelihood, the world was poisoned from the inside out through a rather complex and brilliant scheme. You see, as mentioned, Fortis Binary was a manufacturing world, but it was not a mining world. In fact, it devoured so much raw resources that it could never sustain itself, and what resources it already had largely already been exhausted. Instead, it, like so many other Forge worlds, were fed on foreign imports. Billions of tons of raw ore and metals flooding down onto the world every year. This was Fortis Binary's greatest strength, the ability to turn all of this raw ore into cannons and artillery shells. But the enemy had come up with a ploy. Intermingled amongst all of these raw materials were ores or minerals or metals or chemicals that had been specially treated by the enemy. They had introduced the taint somehow into the very lifeblood of the planet, its fuel and its means of manufacturing. These tainted raw ingredients then made their way through every level of the world's manufactorums, beginning in the enormous refineries where iron ore was melted down into rivers of molten metal, corrupting all the workers along the way with trace quantities of chaos. Then, worked into steel bars or beams, they were further transported into the weapons manufactories, where they would continue to infest the workers, eventually making their way into the grand halls of the artificers, who were adding the finishing touches to the weapons. And every step of the way, the tainted materials were radiating out their wickedness, infecting the workers slowly but surely over the course of probably months, years possibly, as a brief period of exposure to a river of flowing metal containing particles of taint was not enough to corrupt anybody. But over the course of months and years worth of exposure, the workers were beginning to have visions, nightmares. They began to be compelled to fashion the molten metal into little sculptures, little icons, little shrines. Innocent enough at first, a little cast iron sculpture of a vaguely humanoid creature. A statue of the Emperor, probably. Weird, but the Manufactorum overlords would not look twice at the slight little misshaped figure placed in little alcoves here and there. Probably some local patron saint of protection. The Manufactorums are hazardous places, after all. Nothing strange about it. Then a couple more would appear, and a couple more, and a couple more. Soon, the various workers will be wearing pendants fashioned in the same likeness as those strangely misshapen figures. Before long, the Overseer would be wearing one. By the time that the disturbances begin to occur, the strikes, the interruptions in productions, the violent riots, etc., the powers that be on the world would almost certainly dismiss them as simple troubles, which plague all worlds of the Imperium, be they food riots, local uprisings over poor working conditions, or any of the billions of grievances that your average Imperial citizen may have with his nobles. By the time the real nature of the threat was revealed, it would, therefore, of course, be far, far too late. And so Fortis Binary fell. And the poor Imperial Guard forces who were dispatched to retake it suffered enormous casualties, both to enemy action, again, artillery shelling, gas attacks and diseases, but also due to exposure to the corrupted ore. There was one particularly disturbing incident that occurred during one of the countless, mostly pointless offensives launched by Hector Drevere, again a rather blunt instrument. Anywho, the lines of the Tanith First and Only had been assaulted. They had seen off the attackers, and thus, as Drevere was nothing if not a traditionalist, the Tanith were ordered to launch a counter-attack against the Shrevens. This was the back and forth of the trench war that had been going on for the last 6 months. And Colonel-Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt was not expecting much of this other than a demonstration of doing their duties. But, weirdly enough, this time there didn't appear to be a whole lot in front of the Tanith Regiment. There didn't appear to be virtually anything in front of the Tanith Regiment, in fact. Perhaps this was finally it. Perhaps this was, at long last, the break that Hector Drevere had been so longing for. Maybe the enemy had launched an offensive, miscalculated its odds of success, been beaten back in absolute disarray and defeat, and had been incapable of bringing up reinforcements to stymie the inevitable counterattack. He had no idea, of course, how long this break would last, and so he ordered the Tanith to keep pushing, along with the Vitrian Dragoons who were moved up alongside the Tanith. He also ordered the deployment of his elite formation, the Jantine Patricians, under a Colonel Flens. They were to immediately rush up to the front line with main battle tanks and Chimera IFVs to support the breakthrough, and probably take credit as well. But before Colonel Flens and his patricians could arrive, an enormous apocalyptic artillery barrage settled down along the entirety of the front. A truly astonishingly fierce blocking barrage, as if every gun the Shrevens had ever possessed all opened up at once, laying down a curtain of such intense fire that it brought the armored spearhead to a complete halt simply upon seeing it. There was no way to pass through it and live. Unfortunately for the Tanith and the Vitrian Dragoons, well, they were on the other side of the blocking barrage, with the Shrevens. It was starting to look like Macaroth might be getting his 105mm wish. as the Colonel-Commissar immediately speculated that the blocking barrage would now probably begin to shift backwards, towards the Shriven lines and towards the Tanith first and only, pushing them deeper into the Shriven lines, where they would probably eventually be crushed up against an actual fortified line of Shriven infantry. The Colonel-Commissar presumed that this would be a trap, and that his entire regiment was, in essence, already stuck in it. Thus, his only chance was to begin moving forward, as advanced elements of the Tanith First and Only already had. The Ghost Scouts had infiltrated a significant distance deeper into the Shriven lines, and had largely avoided enemy contact. This advanced scout element was under the command of Colonel Corbett, and he was getting mighty nervous as his scouts reported a seemingly endless number of drums beating in the distance. This, then, was probably what the Colonel-Commissar was fearing: the Shriven counterattack, which would now sweep in and annihilate the Guard as they were trapped in against the blocking barrage. But, deciding that dying face-to-face with the foe was preferential to dying with their bayonets in their backs, Colonel Corbett and his scouts pushed forwards, eventually discovering weird structures which they dubbed drum shacks, as the sound of drums did not come from an enormous horde of Shrevens ready to throw themselves at the guardsmen, but instead these weird contraptions. Corbett immediately issued the order to begin destroying them with whatever explosives and weaponry was on hand, as he felt instinctually appalled by their very existence. And again, considering the nature of the enemy and some of their horrific shrines, he was probably right to do so, as another men of the Tanith had been struck with a piece of shrapnel from a destroyed shrine earlier on in the day. This piece of shrapnel had at first appeared to be nothing more than a hunk of molten metal, of slag, but it had transformed the wounded man into a chaos abomination that had to be put down by its previous comrades. Small wonder that Corbett didn't feel like taking any chances. This, however, led to the enemy readjusting their artillery fire, of course, now that they noticed their drum shacks being destroyed. This achieved two things. One, it gave Colm Corbett a very good reason to leg it, as well as the rest of the Tanith and the Vitrians, and it opened up a path through the blocking barrage for the Gentine patricians to begin driving through, with Colonel Flens taking the initiative to push elements of his troops through what appeared to be a break in the enemy's defensive fire. The Tanith and the Vitrians, however, were the ones who got to the heart of the mystery first. You see, Hector de Vere had been at least partially correct when he had assumed that this might finally be the big break. De Vere had, in essence, managed to outbleed the Vitrians over the course of the preceding 6 months. They had launched one last major all-out offensive up and down the front lines to see if there was any way to win this war through conventional means. They had been repulsed completely everywhere. Thus, they fell back on Plan C. The Shrevens retreated to an enormous ritual site, where a gathering of Iron Warriors Chaos Space Marines had constructed a vast edifice, presumably from a lot of the tainted ore. It might even have been the Chaos Space Marines who had initiated this whole plot in the first place. Although, I gotta admit, that does sound unusually devious for Iron Warriors. The truth of that matter will probably never be known, beyond the ranks of the Inquisition at least, as this was a very interesting sight to the Colonel-Commissar, who came upon it whilst leading the Tanith and a few Vitrians as well. What stood before him was a huge monolith. Clearly the center of some sort of ritual that was feeding into a much larger planet-covering ritual, focusing around 7 monoliths. 7 stones of power had been the word spoken to the then young Commissar Gaunt by the Darendan female psyker he had been brought to interview by the Inquisition. Specifically, he had been told 7 stones of power. Cut them and you will be free. Do not kill them, but first you must find your ghosts. Well, here he was, in command of what had so recently been dubbed the Gaunt's ghosts by a sniper whose name was Hlain Larkin, and towering in front of him was definitely stones of power. And so he ordered that the main monolith itself should not be attacked, but rather the smaller monoliths surrounding it. Placing explosive charges whilst fighting off the defenders, the Tanith and the Vitrians were able to topple monoliths around the central spire, causing some sort of a chained reaction, detonating and destroying not just this ritual site, but destabilizing the entire ritual in total, causing all of the remaining Shrivan ritual sites to simply, boom, disappear, winning the war for Fortis Binary in one fell swoop. One might think that this would have been enough to fulfill the Colonel-Commissar's promise of receiving the first world that he conquered, but, well, the ones taking the credit for the victory, of course, would be Hector Drevere and the Jantine patricians, not Gaunt and his newfound ghosts. Though Gaunt and his ghosts had attracted the attention of other forces. Perhaps not forces that Gaunt would ever have hoped to have attracted the attention of, but a lowly regimental commander does not get to dictate in what ways he is to be used. As next week's operation on Minnesoid Epsilon will not only push the Tanith to their limit, but also demonstrate a worrying flaw amongst my colleagues in the Sabbat World's Crusade. We've talked a couple times now about how clever the enemy appears to have been in their infiltration attempts and their efforts to subvert Imperial worlds. Well, unfortunately, it wasn't just planets that the crafty Chaos foe managed to infiltrate. But that, again, will be the topic for next week. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.